I'm interested in what complexity theory is. How do we describe it? Where does it come from? What does it mean? And that's been informed by the fact that I'm originally a physicist, and then I've really engaged with practice through what does it mean for management, what does it mean for economics, what does it mean in fields like development. And I feel quite passionate about it. I feel it's really important. And I suppose my feeling is that if people understood what it means to say the world is complex, we might do a better job of dealing with change, resilience, climate change, inequality. So it comes from a kind of activist perspective. So I've been thinking quite deeply about both how the world changes and how we can play a role in changing the world. So the whole issue around it is first of all people really getting what it means. It's to say the world is complex is not just the English language word where everybody throws their hands up in horror and says, well, I knew that. Yes. It's that the science of complexity enables you to kind of articulate the nature of the complex world more exactly, and that then gives some indications of both how things are likely to change if left to themselves, and equally how we can intervene and engage with the world.
It's very interesting to me the way that many of us have come to complexity because of the problems we work on, problems around development or sustainable development and conservation. For me, I think what struck me the most is your take on complexity and development, or complexity and international development. And I'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit more, why complexity and development?
Well, what struck me, and I don't want to position myself as a kind of complete expert in this field, but I've done a number of pieces of work in this area, and unlike business, which is in a sense at the end of the day there to make money, people in international development are trying to make the world a better place. So there's a lot of kind of moral conviction and heart in it. So when you talk to development workers on the ground, every single conversation you have is about the complexity of the context. It's about the actors, the stakeholders, the shifting context through climate change or war or discovering oil in an area, whatever it is. So the conversations are always about a desire to work more systemically, examples of what goes wrong if you don't work systemically, and a frustration with sometimes an inability to be funded to work in that way. On the other hand, you have a kind of sector which is trying to professionalise, where you have competing INGOs and NGOs who have donors in many cases, and the public who are saying, well, you're getting all this money, we want to know exactly what you're going to do and exactly what the outcomes are. So you've got this real tension in international development between this kind of machine view, which is about tightening up the machine and professionalism and evidence, and a kind of context where people are really more genuinely than I've ever seen in any other sector, really wanting to do their best to do a good job, and it feels a real tension between the two. So I feel that these ideas are both very relevant to the sector, but also have a really important role to play, because I think you need to kind of demonstrate to funders that you're not just kind of giving up and letting it all get woolly and vague by funding longer term, funding more contextually and funding more systemically.
And I mean, this resonates so much with the work that we do on this topic of resilience, where you have on one hand the notion that resilience can be programmed and designed and piloted and scaled. And on the other hand, practitioners who've been working with very resilient systems with an understanding of the context that is relevant to resilience, the capacities and the values attached, I think, to resilience at many scales. And that's proving to be a real challenge, as those are very different perspectives on the problem and the solution.
my kind of understanding of resilience has come more through thinking about ecological systems, and it's all to do with relationships and their kind of interplay, and with the wider context. So in a sense, it's hard for me to even imagine that people would think of resilience in that rather more mechanistic way, because it's inevitably got to be about those kind of balancing relationships, about in human systems, about trust, and about really drawing people together and understanding the wider context. So it is interesting.
I agree, and I think that many of the practitioner communities we're working with are talking a lot about the role of relationships and trust and values and capacities in the context of resilience. And a lot of what you talk about this liability to tip that exists in so many of these systems. And I think that doesn't quite match with some of the designed interventions around that. And that leads me to the next question I have for you, which is about this challenge that many people are very attracted to the ideas of complexity and the theories because of the complex realities and the complex problems that they're working on. Yes. And yet the next step is often requests about what to do now, what methods can I use, yes. What approaches can I use from complexity. Yes. And you talk about that quite a lot in your book, and I wonder if you could take us through a bit of your thinking about complexity thinking versus complexity as method.
In a sense, understanding that the world is complex, by which I mean interconnected, systemic, that there will be multiple causes that are interacting, synergistic, multiple causes to anything. So there's the complexity is about this kind of systemic, context-dependent, historically shaped situation, which nevertheless is not predictable for the future, and the thing that we try to explore is that there's a middle ground. It's not that it's random. It's not that we know nothing about the future. The future is shaped from what exists, but it's not determined by what exists. So we have this idea of emergence and a degree of uncertainty, which is different from the way people think about statistical uncertainty. So the first part that I'm trying to kind of emphasise and deal with groups and people and in my writing is that is the nature, in my opinion, through the lens of complexity, that is the nature of the world. It is complex whether you like it or not. And if we kind of embrace that, we'll do things in a slightly different way. So that takes a lot of, because it's about getting people to even imagine they have a worldview, never mind that they might change their worldview. So it's quite a complex process, and all the issues about when people are kind of invited to reflect on their worldview, it can create a loss of certainty, anxiety, and resistance, because it feels like everything you've been told is being challenged. If you approach complexity with a mechanical worldview, you're just looking for shiny new tools. You want complicated new tools with more twiddly bits and more mathematics in, and that excites you. But you're still trying to reduce the world to certainty, and I'm not saying that's not helpful, but it's still within a different mindset. I think then if you move on to say, well, are there new tools in complexity? I think one of the things that I feel has been probably the most important thing that people pick up on the most is this idea, if you like, of a richer baseline, of the idea that we have to understand the background, whether we're trying to change an organisation or change, a culture or help in development. What interventions happened in the past? Did they work or didn't they? Who were the key players? What's the history of the region? What's going on around the region? What are the economic and social and environmental issues and the political issues?
I think many of us assume that adopting a complexity perspective or recognizing the complexity means that we have to find new methods, create new methods, and that the problem's actually going to be harder to solve. Yeah. And I think you make that point that we can use existing methods, we can tweak them a little bit. Yeah. Your point about it's about looking back, looking up and around, looking down and looking forward. And there are wonderful methods that are designed for that, like scenarios or visioning or system mapping, that are all available right now. And as you say, the sort of flexibility and adaptability, and being aware that unexpected things can emerge when you're collecting data, like on a baseline. Don't only collect data on things that you think are going to happen, maybe collect data on the broader context or on history too for that baseline. And the point that you then make is that this can actually make your job easier because you're matching your methods to the complexity of the problem.
With all the things you think about in a complex world, there are no easy answers to these things. They are a function of context. But sometimes when you've done this kind of broader analysis, it's what they call critical subjectivity. So it's really, this is a subjective view. You're informing it as much as you can in terms of past, present, future, wider pictures, smaller detail, how do these integrate, and doing it with multiple perspectives. But sometimes out of that, with a group, there's something that says, we just need to do this. This would be the thing to focus on. So it actually simplifies the outcome. You know, sometimes we're trying to nudge a situation and a system. We're kind of doing multiple small things to kind of really nudge and move slowly forward. Sometimes there's a sense in which we could do this and this would really have a big impact. So and again, you don't necessarily, people say, well, how do I know? Well, you don't know, but if many of you working together from multiple perspectives, as wide as you can get, senior, junior, you know, suppliers, other people in the field, so you really have an engaged conversation. If you're starting to come up with something that's like, this might work, you know, well, try it. And use it as an experiment. Say, well, we'll try this and see if it works and see what comes. We might have to modify. But I think sometimes the complexity of the diagnostic can make the intervention actually clearer and more simple and more cost effective. So it has that sort of paradox. I think people think that what you're saying is you've got all this complexity and you've got to work with all of it. And I'm not sure that's always true.
There was also, I think, what your writing made me think about a lot is the focus on intervention versus a focus on context. And as I said in the work on resilience, there's often this notion that we can come up with a technical, a financial, or a social intervention, or a combination of interventions, pilot them and then go to scale. And that I find to be a problematic way of thinking. And I think you contrast that beautifully with intervention versus context.
I think there's something about, as I've been saying, you know, understand the wider context and the historical context. This will give you some information about how to intervene. But then see the intervention in some sense as an experiment, because it won't do exactly what you intended it to do. It will have unintended consequences. And the other thing that's really interesting to say is sometimes those unintended consequences are better than you could possibly have imagined. It's not like they're bad and you have to put them right. It's also something about, wow, you know, are we noticing what's emerging here? This isn't what we expected. How do we build on it? So in a sense, there's always a feedback loop from what you're doing back into the thinking, so back into understanding the context. It's a kind of reflexive process rather than you do this and then you do something. It does make me kind of shudder a bit, this kind of phrase about going to scale, because even I've noticed in international development, even when people will pilot, once they've chosen the best approach, they then want to go to scale. And I think that there's a kind of both and about it. Of course, you know, some problems are really big and you want to tackle them more broadly. But it's often so much to do with, you know, even working in one village, you know, the same method won't work in the next village because it's got different people in it and slightly different, you know, agriculture. So is there something that we reframe what we mean by going to scale by saying we have to have real learning communities? So we'll suggest some methods and some principles and go ahead and try those, and then we'll keep getting together and learning, because you might do something and I say in my area, I've never thought of doing that, what a great idea, let's go away and try that. Or I come back and say, well, we tried that and it really didn't work here for these reasons. And you say, well, it's really working well here, but I could also think I could modify it. So you have more of a kind of gentle going to scale, which is more about shared learning than a kind of diktat, because you know, the world isn't like that, and I find that quite frustrating to hear this pilot and then to scale. I suppose at least we've got pilots to try things out, yes. But it's always a reflexive process. Yes. You know, there are some things that need handling at the highest level. You know, we do need INGOs and other bodies to kind of speak out and create some kind of level of you know, I'm really interested in the idea of what does global governance mean. Yes. You know, how does civil society play a role in that? How do bodies like INGOs, you know, who do get heard, play a role in that? And we live in a world, you know, it feels that's increasingly managed and driven by big business, who are largely not accountable in a way, and to the extent they are accountable, it's about growth. It's not about poverty and climate change. So you know, the politics of national governments can only go so far with big business, who can kind of, you know, move resources around the world.
I was wondering as well, something that resonated a lot with me as a South African was the text that you were writing about path dependency and the past. Yeah. And I think that it's always very obvious to most of us working in Southern Africa, the role that the past and the very short-term immediate past has had on the situation that we're in now, and that we're not dealing with a blank canvas. Yes. And I think that that is often a self-evident fact that one doesn't really have to talk about much when you're here. I find in the broader international development or global development, history is often forgotten, and we're often talking about the way forward, but never about where we started or where we've come from. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about that notion of path dependency and how important you think it is in complexity, but also in development.
History matters and context matters. So the way I think about complexity is to say we need to understand how the past has led to the present, because the past is in the present in the sense of what are the deeply held structures, whether they're socio-economic or socio-ecological, or indeed socio-economic, political, you know, all those structures that are there. If we understand the past better, then we have a better way of understanding the present, and therefore how to engage. One of the things I've been in South Africa and Stellenbosch now for 2 months, and it's been one of the richest intellectual periods of my life for years. I found it, you know, hugely stimulating. And when I think about why, it's because all the academics here, and indeed the taxi drivers, you know, are in a sense very aware of climate change, you know, very aware of economic inequality. I mean, it absolutely stares you in the face every single day. You can't go anywhere without being confronted by issues of, you know, well, poverty in all sorts of ways, and climate change, and just the whole, you know, the struggle with how to change a society, and that informs every whatever conversation I'm having about whatever subject. The context of that is in the conversation, and it's in people's heads, and the way they theorise about change or theology or anthropology or, you know, business it's there with you in the room, and they're bringing it, you know, in their bodies and their minds to the conversation. So it's incredibly rich, because you feel that the academics and the activists and people here want to change things. You know, that it isn't sort of pretend. It's absolutely a critical issue for the future. So it creates a kind of context in which I think it brings out the best of people's thinking, and a kind of authentic engagement that is hugely stimulating, and you know, I feel very privileged to, you know, to be part of that. I think, you know, I want to find ways of engaging more with this, because it's so much more alive, and I think the world has a lot to learn from you know, places like South Africa and academics here, because you know, it's real.
Speaking from personal experience, you know, living through fundamental change and turbulent change of apartheid to democracy, or independence from colonial rule in neighbouring countries and war in neighbouring countries, I think the complex and turbulent realities are front and foremost in much of what we think about and see every day, and we're not buffered and protected from it in other ways that you could be. And I think that that does offer us a sort of complex reality to be engaging with in most of the work we do. And it was interesting to be able to reflect on that, spending some time outside of South Africa, to come back in and pick up on some of these things that you're mentioning too. And I think that I wonder a bit about, a lot of us were pushed through a very sort of Western model of education, modelled on the British system. But that wasn't enough, I think, to make us all machine and reductionist thinkers. We were living in these complex realities, so school wasn't real, I think. And many other forms of education exist, and different ways of knowing, and different cultures. So I think there is a richness of context that makes complexity self-evident and obvious in a lot of our work. And yet there is still the battle to push back on the models of international development and economic development that are being forced down on many African countries as the way to move, and the idea of leapfrogging and following the excellent example laid out for us by the rest of the world. And I think that we're sitting in a fortunate situation in South Africa with sort of an academic capacity to be able to challenge that, and a political capacity to challenge that too. And so it is a very exciting time to be here and to benefit from experts such as yourself spending time here and helping us to grapple with understanding how change happens.
Well, I'm not sure I'm helping you. I really, genuinely, I thank you for your compliment, but you all are helping me enormously, and kind of it brings back kind of my, you know, my passionate desire to do something useful. I'm all for hard data. I'm a physicist by background. I understand, you know, hard data, but I think soft data and relationships and building trust is really what's needed to have the deeper conversations and both know how to change things and to be able to change things, which, you know, often you're doing with people.